Kia ora, welcome to Shared Lunch, brought to you by Sharesies with BusinessDesk. My name is Patrick Smelly, I'm the editor at BusinessDesk. Today on Shared Lunch, we're joined by Sir Bill English, former Prime Minister and Minister of Finance in the John Key government, to talk about not so much the election that we've just had as the process of forming a government after an election. But before we get started, here's some important information.
Investing involves risk. You might lose the money you start with. We recommend talking to a licensed financial advisor. We also recommend reading product disclosure documents before deciding to invest. Everything you're about to see and hear is current at the time of recording.
Well, welcome, Bill.
Thanks, Patrick.
Let's talk very quickly about the result. James Shaw called it a shellacking for Labour, and only just more than a third of voters voted for parties at the left. But MMP, in its special way, has delivered a knife-edge result, as so often seems to be the case. So what do you make of what voters have told the next government?
Well, first of all, I think they just wanted change. The previous government had run its course, it had run out of energy, and it didn't really have much of a plan to put to the electorate. So I think the voters were just keen to see a change. Secondly, I think they just want delivery. That is a style of government that says, if you were talking about equity, well, make sure the Māori and Pacific kids actually get immunised. Don't just keep talking about it. And I think thirdly, a pretty strong focus on their economic issues, whether it's directly cost of living or some of the sort of shambolic policy environment that we've had, or what's going on with housing and whether young people can get an opportunity or not.
But nonetheless, they haven't plumped for a simple two-party coalition government, which is what Christopher Luxon would have liked. Now, I'm not going to ask you in depth as to what you think, because everybody in New Zealand's got a view about that. But what I really wanted to concentrate on was the fact that you've been through coalition negotiations several times in the past. So how do you think about that from the inside? What will the leaders of the three parties that are now clearly going to be involved thinking about over this next couple of weeks?
Well, the context for each negotiation is different, and I think this one has a couple of features. One is Winston Peters is now negotiating with a National Party who have no particular history with him, and I think that makes for a clearer air probably than in the past. I think the second difference is that it became clear that that Peters is not exercising a choice between National and Labour, to the point where even New Zealand First had to do their own advertising to say they wouldn't go with Labour. So that, of course, changes everyone's expectations in a coalition negotiation. Look, I think what will be going through their heads is probably a bit of a longer term view, that given that you know who the parties to the coalition are now, with some small uncertainty, but whether New Zealand First is there, then it's not about what the incumbent parties thinking or what their priorities might be. It's really about the interests of these three parties, and that's essentially, I think, allows them in this situation to take a 6-year view. That has been quite a significant shift to the centre-right as it presented to the voters pre-election, not just post-election. That is, it was clear before the election how the parties were going to be aligned, and that's the first time that's happened in our MMP. So therefore, they can take that longer view. So if it's 66, 67 seats as a group, then they can probably think about organising themselves in a way that gets them through the 26 election. Then, of course, each party has to meet the expectations of its voters, and that hasn't changed, whatever the results on the night. And so ACT voters are looking for a particular type of change. New Zealand First voters arguably looking for not too much of it, but keen to see their leader use his experience in government.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. There's also, when you're sitting in those negotiations, you have to think carefully about how much public patience is there for a process to run on.
Well, there's no patience for some 6-week circus, that's for sure. mean, part of the mood for change was to voters wanting to see kind of coherent, effective government acting in their interests. They don't want to see politics being played around, small groups of people trying to hold the system to ransom. I think there's almost zero tolerance for that.
When you're sitting there as Christopher Luxon, wanting to produce both delivery and coherence, but you've got two partners who on some things are a bit never the twain shall meet, does that actually mean that you have to effectively trim your agenda to the things that you can agree on?
Well, I wouldn't quite put it that way. Certainly you have to trim your agenda somewhat because you're not, you didn't get enough votes to run the place. So you've got to work with others, and I think that's well understood. Bear in mind there's the kind of unnegotiated aspects of this. The fact is those three leaders have a pretty good understanding between them of the kinds of things the public want to see change. And though some of them are going to talk about it a lot more, for instance, ACT talk quite a lot more around Māori issues, for instance. But none of them are sort of going to be rampantly progressive, okay? And so there's an underlying coherence there, which won't have to be negotiated. It happens, and actually does make quite a bit of difference to the way that a government runs. And if I was in National's shoes, I wouldn't get overly concerned about, or actually in any of those parties' shoes, overly legalistic about all the coalition positions up front. They'll get time and space to get a lot more done than they even have thought of now, frankly. And it seems to me that's kind of how they're approaching it. We're not hearing tub thumping about, bottom lines that are going to wreck the coalition process. The public pressure to get on with it, I think, will mitigate that as well. So, I'm pretty optimistic about it, and I would imagine that National's had a pretty good look at those other lists of policy, and that they've got pretty clear idea where the clear ground's going to be. Yeah,
without leading you, I'd have thought that there's general agreement that we need to invest in infrastructure to a greater extent than we have. Perhaps a bit of disagreement about exactly how you fund that, but nonetheless a desire to see action. You've got Chris Bishop saying, get ready for that tunnel through Mount Victoria. He's going to be out there himself with a pickaxe by the sounds of things. Skills and education, a lot of concern about that. And I suspect that the social investment approach that you pioneered, I can't see ACT finding that difficult at all, and I suspect that New Zealand First will come for the ride on that. But what about things like climate change policy, where I don't get the sense that anyone's well prepared for that? Just to lead you slightly into the policy area.
Look, that'll be a pretty interesting area. Probably one of the more contentious, I would say. And that's where we've had in New Zealand a pretty reasonably settled sort of bipartisan underpinning of climate change. I wouldn't say everyone's agreed about everything, but an underpinning compared to, say, Australia. So it's worth a scrap for the small parties at the margin. But if you take, say, a group, so ACT will have been listening pretty hard to farmers around climate change. The fact is, the farmers, whether you like it or not, the farmers, the banks who bank the farming community, the supermarkets to whom they ultimately sell their goods and the produce, are on the track for reporting, Scope 3 emissions, and it's complicated and difficult. And the XRB has set these accounting standards, so the system's got well ahead of what domestic politics can actually alter that much. But then there will be other areas. So ACT might, they're going to need to be able to say to farmers, we did things that meant that your compliance costs are reducing and you don't have to worry about it quite so much. And actually, I happen to think there's technology solutions to that as well as policy ones. once people decide they're going to have to do it. But then there'll be areas of agreement. So there's a lot of very expensive climate mitigation policies in government. There's far too many people wandering off to sustainability conferences, talking in waffle that doesn't mean much, but it's sort of part of the branding of the company, and I'm talking corporate people here. And of course it's worse in the public service. So I'd imagine they can all agree to stop the waffle, to stick to the core thing, which is a price mechanism, and ACT and National will be strong on that. And again, just reduce the noise in the system, knock back the big energy project down south that was the previous government was very keen on. The Onslow thing, which would release investment in the market because it was going to hang over the market for the next 10 years. So I think they'll agree on enough, but then ACT and New Zealand First will be reasonably demanding about their voters being able to see tangible, if not tangible results that actually they won't mind, but looking painful, right? And that's one thing National will have to get used to, and particularly the public service, is coalition parties make you do things you don't want to do. That's part of the deal. We had this experience. People forget we were in coalition with the Māori Party for 9 years. And they were very effective advocates. And most of the time, they were pushing for things that were challenging.
Yep.
And the system has to adapt to that. So I think you'll get a bit of a picture of the leaders being kind of publicly more coherent, perhaps, than people expect, but then a process inside that gets fairly robust as it gets used to doing painful things.
Interesting. So let's assume that everybody plays nicely. We get to November the 3rd, things are sufficiently coherent that we've maybe got a government by the 5th, say. So then Christopher Luxon can have his first prime ministerial trip to the Cook Islands for the Pacific Island Forum, possibly, or possibly not. How realistic, putting your ministerial hat on now, is it to think that they can get real momentum prior to Christmas? When you think of the number of things that they want to do, can you actually put a mini budget together? I suppose it depends how mini it is before Christmas. You're going from a standing start in early November.
Look, this will be, I think, the first big test for the public service, because the public service have got used to this kind of odd mix of a lot of business around transformation and very little to show for it. So it's not that they don't know how to be busy; they do. It's just they've forgotten how to be effective, I think, with some honourable exceptions. And you got a government coming in where probably fewer people know much about how the government system works than we've seen in a government for a long time.
Yep.
And that is going to be a good freshening up challenge, because you'll get ministers just asking basic questions like, why is that going to take 6 weeks when we've already made a decision about it? Or why do you have to write 15-page reports when we know what we want to do? Just go and do it. And everyone learning each other's language. So yes, there is time to do a mini budget. There may be quite a necessity. One of the bigger fiscal, I think, problems is going to be the pay equity issue, where the former government made sure it had enough money to pay its own employees on pay equity, its own nurses. But I've been told a number of times they've significantly underestimated the cost of funding that for all the services that are provided outside of, provided by NGOs and others.
But which are government funded.
But which are fully government funded, and where they promised to pay. And that shortfall could be a thick end of $1 billion over the next couple of years. So there'll be more surprises like that. And I think the government should just, if they're smart, they're not going to be constrained by the public service saying we're tired. And there's not that long. I think they'll barrel into it.
I can't help but ask. You can tell me just I don't know, but if there are a couple of $1 billion worth of unfunded liabilities out there, plus you've got New Zealand First and ACT both saying they're not sure about this tax package, that feels kind of negotiable at some level.
Well, I don't think that a tax cut package is negotiable. You might be able to trim it back a bit or something, in the face of something new. But Treasury should have done it. Should have done its pre-election update job reasonably well. Let's assume it's somewhere near, because what's 500 million plus or minus an election campaign? Well, nothing.
Yes.
But it's real once you're in government. So maybe there'll be a bit of trimming around that. I think it's going to be quite important with respect to the management of the government finances to get their framework right for that, because cuts are going to be useful. That's how ACT see the world in particular at the moment. But in the long run, it's performance. It's delivery of services to people that can underpin the kind of significant support that this coalition has earned in this election. I mean, if they want it to be still there in 2026, one way to keep the voters in Mount Roskill, where they're a bit surprised at how many they got, is because by then those voters will have forgotten the COVID lockdown. They would have forgotten whatever they didn't like about Ms Ardern or Mr Hipkins.
Yep. And
they'll be more concerned about whether the things Chris Luxon said he would do about education are actually happening for their kids.
Yep.
And you don't get there just by focusing on cuts. You've got to focus on performance for customers. Think of the public as customers. And Chris Luxon has that instinct, and I think that will help them.
You've talked about this a little bit, but how well prepared is the public service to orientate itself to that not particularly controversial outcome?
Well, I don't think that well, but look, if you looked at recent performance, but then recent performance is heavily conditioned by the political direction that they've had. And what I've found, having been through to a couple of changes of government, I think 3, is it depends on how the government articulates what it wants to do. So if there's a strong focus on delivery, then you'll find the doers shuffle to the front eventually, and the talkers shuffle off because they don't have the skill set to deliver. And so there's quite a lot of shuffling around to go on in the public service. And remember that the majority of them are professionals, and they know that they're subject to political change and different new political directions, and they will want to change direction. The challenge will be whether they've got the tools to actually deliver on that direction. And my concern for this incoming government is that the ability to transact and deliver is lower than it's been in a long time. Not for a lack of will, just on the part of the public servants, but just that those tools haven't been used for a while.
Why on earth not? Is that a failure of the public service, or is it a failure of a cabinet?
I think a bit of both. I mean, I could use a lot of examples because we operate on the edge of the charitable and social and health services. But a good high-profile example that came up in the campaign was child immunisation. How can you explain that those rates used to be mid-90s, and they were all up in the mid-90s, multi-Pacific, European, roughly the same. And over the last 6 years, they've dropped steadily and they've dispersed. So now Māori are the lowest, I think, or in Pacific lower, and the Pākehā rate's the highest. Well, everyone knows what to do. Everyone knows how important it is. Everyone knows that it's pretty basic for the welfare of our children. But the system has delivered less and less. And this is at a time when the health budget is up 60% on 6 years ago. So there is a core productivity and delivery problem. And I know it sounds a bit kind of businessy talk, but if you've spent 60% more and your immunisation rates have dropped, and in the health system, the output is the same as 6 years ago. At least it hasn't dropped. The number of outpatients and GP visits is roughly the same. But we're spending 60% more on it. Then there's a bit of system change.
Yeah. Do you think somebody in there understands what that system change needs to look like? Because it's easy enough to become the Minister of Health and say we're not achieving anything with 60% more budget, but if you don't know where to go looking, where the bodies are buried, it's going to be a bit difficult to change that.
No, I don't think they do. I think the focus on equity as language, and the focus on transformation as the main point, that the system's there to enable hundreds of consultants and lots of public servants to mill around writing papers and plans for plans. I think the capacity is a bit reduced, significantly reduced actually, because what it requires is a kind of honesty. Right, and you'll notice, like in the economic sphere, there's so many people measuring everything and contesting the analysis and arguing, is inflation transitory or sticky, or lots of opinion. And so if you don't know what you're talking about, well, you get cast aside, or people stop listening, or your business goes under. It doesn't work in government. There isn't those pressures. There isn't that contest. And so the whole system can deteriorate. So unlike in the market, the whole market doesn't deteriorate. People who are
just the underperformers.
So if I've got a worry for the incoming government, it would be the same one I think that the outgoing government had, and that is, what the hell are they going to do next with some of these areas that have got big and that are large and difficult? And so health is certainly one.
So how important then, and it's a bit of a gimme question because it was your idea to start with, but the social investment approach, small number of targets carefully chosen for their impact across a wide range of things, presumably is one of the ways to at least get leadership focus into the system.
Yeah, and I think that'll work, and so I hope I hope the government does that, because I can't see, because talking won't work. The only thing that'll work is clarity and public transparency, including for ministers. Ministers are accountable as well as public servants for achieving particular things, and targets are always arguable. You can say it should be this or it should be that. Well, let's have that discussion. But if you actually want to lift the immunisation rate, then you've got to think much more concretely about what equity means. And so you'd spend less time on categorising everyone as Māori or Pacific, and more time in actual communities with actual people who might be Māori, Pacific, Indian, Vietnamese, Pākehā, whatever. Just get the kids immunised. And of course, for those, if there's a way of doing it at the marae, well, why wouldn't you? Or at the down at the Pacific Methodist Church. Well, of course you'd do that, because that's how you get it done. And I think that shift in emphasis is going to be quite important. First, for delivering better service to people who need it, because those kids who aren't getting immunised are getting let down. And secondly, in the long run, for fiscal control, because in the long run, the best way to control government spending is to control the demand for it. Of course, you can get more efficient, keep going at that. But if you've got, people with significant mental illness, quite unsupervised, who take up 100 nights a year in a hospital bed, then why don't you just do something about that person? It doesn't matter how many consultants you put in Wellington, that person's, until you change it, they're going to be there for 100 nights next year.
So, the social investment approach got a couple of years before the Labor came in and kind of decided they didn't want to do that.
Yeah.
Is it possible to kind of encapsulate where that had got to and what you'd learnt that a new government should do that you might not have realised when you first started? Is there a possibility to accelerate what did seem to be a fairly effective program?
Yeah, I'd say what's changed, because these things are never the same, right? You don't want to be going on about the old days. What's changed is that the capacity to deliver individualised or family-based services, community by community, is now greater. That is, you've got stronger iwi, you've got stronger Pacifica organisations, you've got some now significantly more experienced and capable NGOs, partly out of COVID actually, There was a big money flowed through all these organisations. The smart ones put it in the bank or used it to develop their capacity alongside delivering the services. The ones who weren't smart just wasted the opportunity. There's now the technology and the tools around is now so cheap and accessible. We know that because we work with it every day. You don't need to be a government agency to know what to do about youth offending or where they are or who could deliver best. That knowledge can now be held widely, and the technology allows you to track, to deal with transactions for every individual at quite low cost. But I think the gap between public services is similar in Australia, between public services and the reality of what's going on with customer-focused technology is wider than it's ever been. And if this government wants to control spending and deliver good services, then I'd say the next step in all this process is reach out over your mainstream government agencies who really haven't changed much in 50 years and have the same failure now as they had 50 years ago. And it's, bottom 15% suffer for that. Reach out over them to those communities and get involved in the messy, difficult business, but ultimately more effective business of working in among those populations with the best tools that are around now, rather than the kind of old style, very inefficient policy process with a bit of stats data.
Let's talk a bit about the socioeconomic, or particularly the economic backdrop for the next 3 to 6 years, because look back over the last 15 years, even though we've had earthquakes and COVID and everything else, the one thing we've had as a massive tailwind is enormous amounts at a global level of fiscal largesse and loose monetary policy, lowest interest rates we haven't seen a business cycle for about 15 years. What's it going to be like for New Zealanders and a government trying to manage their expectations about the end of cost of living crisis and a better future? Because it seems to me that that's actually quite a significant additional challenge to whatever the government's agenda might be.
You're sounding a bit nostalgic for a business cycle, Patrick.
Oh yes, I can't wait.
But you're quite right. It's not just that. Well, you've enumerated a couple of the tailwinds, but the other ones I'd add have been the longer term decrease in interest rates until quite recently, where, as my own children have pointed out, and I know it's not going to be nice when they start out with the word boomer, all you had to do was hold assets and you got wealthy. And actually it's the same across the financial markets, housing market. All these people thought they were smart. Actually, they were just holding assets, and interest rates went down, values went up. That was it. Yep. The Chinese growth story is much more complex than it was. So interest rates are now going to be volatile and sort of up and down, not on this long-term trajectory that's positive for asset holders. Chinese uncertainty, and that was quite a tailwind coming out of our last recession. And as you've just said, fiscal largesse, that's come to an end when even the centre-left party is campaigning on spending cuts. That tells you something. And reserve banks, where the level of confidence in them is just a way lower, they're not going to be politically allowed to do what they were allowed to do previously. And they made enough mistakes that the costs of those mistakes are going to be with us for a while. So a lot of those tailwinds, they're all tailwinds that have gone. So the outlook, if I was a government, I'd be keeping expectations pretty reasonable, low to moderate, rather than high. And you can see a process unfolding, whether it's on the NZX or elsewhere, where performance is going to matter. So businesses who know what they're doing are still going to do well, and there's going to be growth and there'll be opportunities. Businesses that are getting caught now in this vice of rising costs of servicing debt, because that's still going up, flat to falling revenue, not the best grip on their customers because it didn't have to be that good, you're going to see those fall away. And you're not going to have a tide coming through that lifts everyone up again. So performance will matter.
Yeah. So Any advice? I'm going to ask you for advice for three groups of people. New ministers, people who've never been ministers before.
Look, one is don't miss the opportunity. Like the people who did the work in opposition really understand their subject matter can be incredibly useful and find it satisfying as a minister because you've got some real say. I'd say that's number one. But second piece of advice is keep very clear who the customer actually is. It's not the officials. And actually, your colleagues are important, but they're not, in the long run, the most important for your political job, that's for sure. But there's a whole lot of New Zealanders out there who just need you to focus on their needs. And every day you should be sitting there as if one of them's on the other side of the desk. How would I explain this to this small business owner, to this mother of a disabled child? Yeah, the old lady who's going to have the cycle lane blast through her car park she always uses when she goes to the supermarket. So keep that in mind. Keep your feet on the ground.
Prime Minister?
It's not a business. Okay, and what I really like about Chris Luxon is how quickly he's learnt that, because he's only had the shortest time ever to learn it. But I think his strengths, this is it couldn't have been really better designed for him, where people want competent management of basic things to work well, and the chaos to subside, and the investment environment to become a bit more predictable to the extent that we can that we can control it. And I think the other piece of advice would be, it's hard for a prime minister to keep their instincts about where the public are, even if you've been in politics for quite a while. And if I was him, I'd make sure that he has a broad range of people, including people who aren't part of the kind of political establishment, to whom he can listen and just keep head-checking direction on government. And it's actually one of the benefit, I have to say, of coalition partners, which is, I think, what New Zealanders in their wisdom decided they wanted with MMP, is coalition partners who are listening to parts of the community you're not listening to. And they bring that in, and you want to make sure you listen to that.
Finally, and bearing in mind that this does not constitute investment advice, if you were an investor, how would you think about the next 3 years and the government that we now have or are going to get?
Well, in the first place, have some expectations of them, and that is if you want the government part of the investment environment to become more certain, more predictable, more supportive. And if you don't see that, then tell them. That I think that's really, really quite important, not just sort of passively sit back. The second thing is that, I think there's been a lot of interaction between the business and corporate community and government over, subsidies and transformation and sustainability and that stuff. I'd start to see that as a bit of a danger signal. That is, if people are still talking about that when they face this volatile macro environment and geopolitical tension that, is the Israel-Gaza war going to crank up oil prices again. You want the people who are looking after your well focused on really what matters to it. And yes, sustainability and those things are part of it, but they're just part of it, and they must sit alongside of a firm grip of the basics. Where are our customers? And it happens that both in Australia and New Zealand, the customers, given the opportunity to vote, have voted against the corporate tide. In Australia, they voted against yes when most of corporate Australia helped finance it. And in New Zealand, no one, the way the vote's gone is not in favour of, not strongly supporting endless chatter about how wonderful the world could be. It's a much more realism here. What the hell's really going on? Protect my investment, get my cost of living down, make sure those people over there on whom we're spending the taxes are getting what they should be getting. That's the mood.
So we've seen a real collapse in business confidence, particularly in the last year or so. There's an expectation that business confidence generally rises when there's a blue government. How much of that is going to be real versus, and how much will you think it'll change the way that people behave, and how much is actually on the government to make that real?
Well, look, for the good of the economy, it needs to be real. And I think that, in government, you don't get to fix everything at once. So, but you can fix some things sufficiently to make it real. So you want, for instance, a more predictable, less politicised infrastructure pipeline where it looks like there's people allocating capital in ways that make some sense, rather than 5 years on again, off again, light rail or the Dunedin Hospital or something, sort of multi-billion-dollar project. Kiwi Rail one's out of control. It just undermines people's. And you'd be operating in the small private company world. It's surprising how those things cascade down through the system. I think the other is the whole energy transition, where some of the obsessions of the previous government can be quite quickly dismissed. The core of the policy is okay, but get rid of the noise. And there's some then you can start dealing with some of these significant issues like the role of gas in the transition, and whether you can actually get enough renewables with offshore or whatever. But more time solving actual problems rather than just kind of talking. So those, like infrastructure and energy, if you could get those settled down, I happen to think there's room to do better on our banking regulation, actually, because availability of credit is vital, and we've through these events of recent years got into a no risk banking system.
Tell me about it. Yeah.
And why do we want that? Because we've got to have some fuel for the fire here, and New Zealand is a small economy. We're not going to have the option of private credit, which has now become the kind of marginal source across a lot of the developed world, and a lot of talk about it. We're still going to be pretty dependent on banking, and I think that the sense in the banking system and the regulators is they no longer understand risk, which is risk is something that you take, not something you spend all your time trying to expunge, because you're financing business who are taking risk, and it's quite acceptable for sometimes that to go wrong. Particularly when the depositors are all guaranteed. So I just think it's another area where we need to reorientate again around risk, because what we've seen happen in New Zealand is sort of quite significant chunks of economic activity dealt with in a hugely risky way with government capital.
Yes.
And you think, well, that's not very smart. And I think the last area which is a bit tangled and going to be very challenging is around housing. But if there isn't progress on housing affordability, we will almost certainly end up with wealth tax and comprehensive capital gains tax, because the people shut out of the market are not going to tolerate another round of house price growth where they're locked out just because of essentially political settings around the regulation of land and infrastructure.
Interesting. Thank you. Well, thanks for your time today, Bill. And thanks for everyone for tuning in. You can watch Shared Lunch on YouTube or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a star rating and a comment with who and what you'd like to hear about in the future. We also have a special offer for Sharesies investors from BusinessDesk. If you use the promo code SHAREDLUNCH2023, you'll get $100 off the annual subscription to BusinessDesk, usually $349 including GST, and if you're an individual subscriber, you can get the Wall Street Journal along with it. This offer only applies to new BusinessDesk subscribers, can only be used once per subscriber, because how many times can you read the Wall Street Journal after all, and can't be used with any other discounts. Enjoy the rest of your week.